Hope everybody's having a fantastic day so far. So, thought I'd start just reading my session description for you all, because that's usually a good way to start a session. So, gotta make a move to a theme system that's right for me. Components keep me moving, keep me grooving with some energy. At MidCamp we talked about it. At Drupal Con talked about design components. Gotta move on from data model templates. Gotta move on from style guide markup duplication. Gotta move on. Won't you take me to Chunky Town? Won't you take me to a chunky town? Won't you take me to a chunky town? Won't you take me to a chunky town? Chunks, mega chunks, chunks, super chunks, chunks inside chunks. Won't you take me to a chunky town? All right, so there we go. That's So, all right, so we're going to talk about component-based theming and what might happen in the future of Drupal. So this is kind of like, hey, here's a direction we might head in with Drupal to make some improvements and make some things better and that sort of thing. So I'm Marc Drummond. I'm a front-end developer at Lullabot. We make some pretty great websites. We do strategy and design and development, and right now we're hiring for back-end developer. So if you're a back-end developer and you're looking to do some Drupal with Lullabot, come talk to me later. That's my daughter Izzy. That's my wife Rita. On Twitter you can find me at Marc Drummond. I have a blog at markdrummond.com. Drupal.org. I'm mdrummond. So I help out with Drupal 8. I helped do some contributions on the front end things with Drupal. I really like working with tools like Pattern Lab and other things that help you do some more component-based stuff with Drupal, and I'd like that to work better. So I want to talk about how we can do that. So how many people were at DrupalCon New Orleans? A few people? Or how many people watched the Dries note that weren't at DrupalCon New Orleans? So like a lot of people, right? So my highlight for DrupalCon New Orleans, that was the first DrupalCon I've ever been to, and Dries mentioned component-based theming in his Dries note as here's something that might happen down the road. And it was like a minute, so it was pretty quick, and I wanted to talk about some more of that. Sure, what does that mean? What is this component-based theming that we're talking about? And we kind of got a conversation going earlier this year at MidCamp. In Chicago in March, and I was getting ready to get on the airplane there. I was eating a sandwich, and I started writing down some notes about like here's some things we could do about component-based theming. And then I got there, and I was like, here's this crazy idea. And I talked to a bunch of people, and they said, hey, I've had that same crazy idea, or I have ideas along those same lines. And there was a lot of people who wanted to do some discussions about this, about how we can make Drupal more component-based. And so we've been having a lot of chats and conversations about what we could do to make that happen. And so we put up a whiteboard, and we put like the word chunk on there. I put the word chunk on there because I thought that was funny. But chunks and super chunks and mega chunks, and you might be thinking to yourself, like, what is all this chunk stuff? I'm not sure I'm in favor of that word being used as much as it is so far in the first 3 minutes of this talk. So what are chunks? So chunks, I'm talking about components. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is, but you might be thinking, okay, like, what is this and why do we really want to make this a thing? Why do we want to make this happen? Like, I don't know. I was looking for bell-bottom like photos and things, and I was like, you know what, this is kind of the fashion again. So it's like, it's not as, or maybe doesn't seem like that, like, yeah, okay, we should do that. I'm hoping by the end of this that you'll say, hey, yeah, like go-go boots, those are a thing we should make happen again. Like we should make this happen. Components should be a thing, and I want to make it happen. So, all right. So, le funk, say junk. We're going to talk about what components are. We're going to start off by talking about that. And what does it mean? What is a component and why do we care? So components. Components is basically, why I talk about chunks is because it's taking a design and breaking it down into components. A lot of times, there's a lot of usages of the word components. But as a front-end developer, this is what I care about a lot. Because it's what I do on a lot of projects is we take a design and we break it down into smaller parts. So you might have a design like this, where, all right, there's a design. Now we've got to figure out how do we, instead of like writing each HTML and CSS like from the top down to the bottom, how do we break that down into a way that's a lot more manageable? So you might look at that and you say, okay, so that top part, there's a banner component up there. There's features. There's some body copy. There's some related content, a footer, some social links, copyright. Each of those are like one manageable chunk of the website. At the very top level, those are some of the top level chunks that we're going to look at in this design, and we're going to break it down. But then as you look at that, you realize you can go a little bit further. In that banner, you've got multiple parts in that. You've got a smaller component that's like the branding component. You have the menu component. You have the banner text. And so each of those are one subcomponent of the larger component. You've got that features component. Well, it's composed of individual features, an individual component that you might use in a lot of different places in your website. And so you kind of break things down into smaller and smaller pieces. So it's kind of like a brick house. And so what exactly is a component? It's a brick house, quite literally. It's like a Lego. So a Lego is great. I love Legos and Duplos. Duplos are fun too. But they're cool because you have one little piece and you can reuse it in lots of different ways. I just love my daughter. She's like almost 4, and I get to talk to her a lot because I've got like 40 minutes left, 50 minutes left. Anyways, so you're going to hear more. But my daughter loves building things, and she'll take these, components that are made for one, little castle thing, and reuse them in lots of different ways. And that's the great thing about components is you can reuse them. So, but what is a component? So, a component has data. A component has some information. If you go down to like a component for an event teaser, right? So you've got a list of events, and you've got a teaser for an event in that listing. So you might have an event date in that teaser. You have a piece of data. But then you can also have components that can contain other components, like we talked about that header section, right? You can have smaller parts that are also a component in and of themselves. A component usually, you might say, here's the CSS for just this component. Here are the styles that apply just for this component. Here is some JavaScript that's just related to this particular component. Maybe there's some images, like some social icons or things that are related to just that component. And ideally, you have one template that you can go to that has all the markup, all the HTML for your one component. So if you think about a component, it's kind of like this. It's kind of like, it's a bunch of different things. It's your HTML. It's all the stuff that's related to this one little chunk on your website. And there's one thing we haven't talked about yet, and that's context. So context is about component communication. I think it's also like Legos. So when you search disco and Legos, this is what you get, which I approve. So I promised I would bring a disco ball, so not only there, but like right here, it's like a Death Star shaped disco ball. Okay, so components need to communicate with each other. So a component can have a child component. You can have a parent and you can have a child. And that child component needs to get data from the parent component. That's where it gets it. It passes it down from one level to another level. And a component also needs to say, hey, you have their parent component. This is the type of data I need. If you want to use me, this is the data that I need. The context is another way to put that. And I think this is kind of like Legos. So if you have a Lego, then, I don't know what the perfect analogy is here, but the things on the top, maybe that's the data that is coming into the Lego, And the context maybe is the bottom pegs. We're saying, here's the things that I need to fit into in order for this to work. So you've got data up, you've got data down. You got to get up to get down. This is a concept some JavaScript frameworks do. They kind of divide this up a little bit more. React has this model of pieces of information that are either props, properties, or state. So what does that mean? So props means you might have a piece of data that is always going to stay the same no matter what. But then you also might have some information about a component that is going to change based on the way that you interact with it. You might have a form that changes based on your interactions. And so React has this model where this is just one way that you can work with component state, where you might push a button and then that triggers an event, and then that changes the overall model for the state, and that gets pushed back down into the component, and then the component changes. So you have something like this. You have a parent and child. Somebody presses the button, says, hey, state, change my information. It's like, OK, I'll pass it down to the parent. Parent passes the child and goes from this to that. So that's something that some places that use components really care about, is differentiating between props and state. So, OK, that's neat. Now you might understand, people understand a little bit better what a component is. Is that making sense, right? So, OK, who cares? So a component, why is that cool? So a component is neat because if you do it right, it can be encapsulated. And a component only needs to know about itself, and it's not going to necessarily get affected by something else you do on the rest of your site. And that's really handy. It's also really good because we talked about how you can use a Lego in multiple places, right? So if you make a component once and you do it in a good solid way, then you can use that component again someplace else on your site. And then you have to do a lot less work. And I think that's great. So being efficient is a good thing. And components are really great for teams because they are encapsulated. If you're working on one component and somebody else is working on another component, if you have things in a contained way, then you can do your thing, they can do their thing, and that work isn't going to interfere with each other. You can hopefully work confidently knowing that you're not going to accidentally screw something else up for somebody else. You can divide up the work. That's very good, especially when you have a team. And then potentially there might be performance benefits from this. Front-end performance is something I care a lot about, and the things that we're doing for front-end performance optimization are probably going to be changing pretty soon because of a big change called HTTP2. And front-end performance optimization for a long time has been about, let's bundle everything together. Let's make one big giant file with all of our CSS for the site, and that way it gets downloaded once, and then it's only one request to the server, so that's a good thing. And the reason was because it was very expensive to have multiple requests going on with a browser. And HTTP2 makes it a lot more efficient to have multiple requests going on at the same time. And so that is going to change our optimization strategy. Because instead of sending one big bundle of stuff, it would be better if we only sent the stuff that was necessary at any given time. Because then you're not getting stuff you don't need. That sounds good, right? And so components are cool because you can say, here's all the stuff that's needed for this particular component. Then you can say, here's the components that are getting downloaded on the page. Download those things. So that's neat. OK. So those are some of the benefits, but who does this affect? What does this matter? So designers. Designers, a lot of design that's happening today is being done in a component-based way. We have responsive web design, and you have designs that need to flex across a wide variety of screen sizes. You might have a complex site that has a lot of different potential landing pages and different modes that you have to design for. And if you use components, that's really nice because then you can potentially reuse some things throughout the site, create consistency, and have to design less individual one-off things. That's a real benefit. And it ends up working really well for then implementing that design. Front-end developers have been working in a component-based way for a while, and we talked a little bit about how you break a design down into smaller and smaller components, individual components, rather than working on the thing as a whole. How many people have used BEM before with CSS? A few people. So BEM is a syntax, a kind of a common way of writing your CSS classes. Instead of applying a bunch of different CSS classes in your HTML that say, this class makes something red, this class changes the font size, you say, hey, we're going to try to, as much as possible, apply one class that says, here's what this thing does, and then in our CSS, we're going to say, here's all the rules that apply. And one thing that's really nice is this works, I think, pretty well with responsive web design, because you can say, here's the media query values where something changes in the way this looks. And you don't have to put a whole bunch of, it can get really messy if you just have lots and lots of classes on an HTML element. For some situations, it works really well, but I like BEM. BEM stands for Block Element Modifier. And what that means is a block is like event teaser. That's the object. So the event teaser, this is all the styles for the event teaser. And then we have two underscores saying here the event teaser name is a child of the event teaser, and so is the event teaser date. And then we might have a double dash that says event teaser fundraiser. This is a variation on an event teaser. I'm going to have slightly different styles for that. So it comes up with conventions and documentation for here's how we write our CSS. And the nice thing is that when you do this way, again, it provides some sort of encapsulation so that I can work on my styles over here for my component, you can work on your styles over there, and we're not going to run into each other and have problems that way. So front-end developers also tend to use components in style guides is one thing. So KSS Node is a pretty popular style guide right now that works really well with Drupal 8. It has Twig. And so there's a list of the components on the left-hand side. And then you can see the components, and you can say, all right, here's how this thing looks, and here's how there are some variations of these things. And then you can go in one place. And you have a really good documentation for, all right, if I want to make a thing that looks like this, I can find that component, and I can find the markup that creates that. Somebody who's new that's getting on board a project can see, hey, this is a way that this gets done. So there's a lot of good things about that. Another tool that I really like is called Pattern Lab. And I'd say a pattern library is a little bit different from a style guide, because a pattern library tends to be more about showing how different components work together with each other, how they come together and get reused. So you can pick all kinds of different components you want to take a look at, and then you can do some kind of neat things. You can change, without changing moving your browser width, you can change the width for how big these display, so that's kind of a neat tool. But there's lots of other pattern libraries, Pattern Builder and Fractal and Drizzle, and that's really neat. Working with components with that is neat, but we'll talk about, there's some challenges with getting that to work with Drupal. Who else uses components? So front-end developers that are working on more the interaction side, people who work with JavaScript a lot. There's a lot of components that are being used in the JavaScript world. Angular, React, Ember, all of those are in those JavaScript frameworks, which are pretty popular, are having components in one form or another where you're trying to get down to this encapsulated piece of your code that you can reuse. JavaScript in general, ES 2015, people have heard of ES 2015? So it's a newer standard for JavaScript. Came out last year. There's some newer updates in ES 2016, shockingly this year. But one of the things is making JavaScript more modular and building that in. There's some tools like Webpack and Browserify that help you keep JavaScript in individual files and roll them all together in one aggregate, but JavaScript's doing that natively without having to use an extra tool. And so support's not fully there yet, but again, it's kind of a more way to break things up into different parts. And another thing that's in the horizon is something called web components. Chris Weber is not in the room, or I'm sure he'd be like really excited right now, because he's a huge advocate of web components. A lot of people are getting excited about this. This is something that's been talked about for a couple years now, and the idea is instead of putting like div class equals blah 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 into your HTML, you might have like a HTML element, I guess, named blah 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 itself, like blah dash blah dash blah, and something like that. So you can create your own HTML elements, and then you encapsulate the CSS and the JavaScript right within that element itself, and you prevent outside interference with that. You have a shadow DOM that lets you do the DOM stuff within it, but it doesn't interfere with things out of it. And there's already a lot of support for this in Chrome, but it's probably coming to, some elements are coming to Safari soon, and there's a polyfill that lets this work in older browsers called Polymer. And I think it's going to be a big deal in the next year or two. So getting Drupal to move towards that would be a good thing. So site builders. I think site builders would benefit from having Drupal being more component-based as well. There's been some talk. Dries has had a lot of blog posts lately about outside in, about improving the user experience. Kevin O'Leary has been doing some models of how we could have user interface things that instead of right now, like Drupal's site building experience is kind of, there's a lot of different places you have to go to make things work. A lot of times you have to go to a content type and change some fields around there. But like a lot of times people are thinking more of, I want to think at the top level, here's a page and I want to put a chunk, I want to put a section on the page and then some smaller chunks in there and like go from the top level to the down. And that really fits with the way we've been talking about components. So I think there could be some people who would benefit from that in Site Builder, that are site builders. And I'll get into that a little bit more. Another way I think it kind of helps to get your head around components is thinking about how there can be different kinds of components. So pages. Have any people worked with panels? Right? So panels lets you define different page types, right? And in a way, that itself is a page component. It's a model of here are the things that you put in for this type of page. And so you might have a header section, a main section, and a footer section. But maybe that's a different model on a landing page or on an article page. Maybe you have article and like a related content or something. So a page component is one type of component. And then you go level down, and you might have a header component. I like to think of these as section components, where it's something just below that top page level. But you're going to have some subparts to that. You're going to have your branding component that might have your logo and your name of your organization. You have a search component that has a search bar and a go button. You have a menu component that has all your menu items for the header. So there's smaller parts within that section component. And then I call this an item series. So a river of news is a really good example of this, where you have a list of smaller components that are all related to each other in some way. Some of those might be things where it's an automatically generated list that's sorted by time, or maybe this is something where you've manually sorted the list of items that are related to each other. And then you might have an individual item. So you might have an individual article teaser. And that has kind of more granular, it's a lower level component where you're really getting down to the data level. Instead of containing other components, you've got a headline. You've got a byline that might have the author name and the date. You have an image. You have some body copy. You have a list of tags. And that tags one is interesting because there's smaller pieces within that. So like a series of data items. Again, you have some pieces of related content. You have individual tag items and you have a heading. And those are all kind of related to each other. That's kind of like a component. And then within the individual item, you might have a couple of different variables, like the link, the URL that a tag goes to, and the text itself. And then you might have other components that combine a bunch of different things. The Flyout menu is a good example, where you're combining some individual pieces of data with other subcomponents together. And then I think there's another kind of component that's like a layout component, where I think this is in a way a component as well. So you'll see this in panels a lot, where you have a generic layout, where it's really friendly for site builders, where some of the components I've been talking about, it's something you've planned out ahead of time, and you say, I know exactly what's always going to go into these various slots. But maybe you say, I don't know exactly what things are going to go in here, but I'm going to have some general slots where there's going to be 2 columns, maybe it's 1 column on mobile. And so that's kind of a component layout in and of itself. But all of these things are basically a component, in a lot of ways, is one particular item that generally has slots for other things contained within it, either a piece of data or another component. So, all right. Do people feel they have a good grasp of what components are and maybe why to care about them? Anybody have any? Feeling good? All right, cool. So what about Drupal? How does this connect to Drupal? You know, at first I was afraid. I was petrified. I didn't know if we could make these components, work inside of Drupal. But but we continued on, and I don't know. I think we'll survive. So so how do we make this work with Drupal itself? So there's some things that are kind of like components in Drupal right now, and you can make stuff work kind of with components in Drupal. Like, we build sites that use components. Like, there's ways to do this. Blocks. Blocks are really, I think, one of the things that are most like a component. I mean, there's a lot of different types of blocks in Drupal. But a block is generally, something that you put into like a region, and you put it into something else. That's like a component. And so if you look at, so that's one particular thing. And blocks in Drupal 8 are a lot better. They're a lot more powerful, and they understand context a lot better. The context module is like not a thing for Drupal 8 because blocks have been improved a lot. So that's something that's kind of useful. Display modes. So node, you've got a node, you've got a content type, you've got an article content type. And you might have a full display mode or a teaser display mode. In a way, that's a component. And a lot of times, I like to use display modes a lot because if I have a node and it's going to be reused in a lot of different places on a site, rather than manually going into views every time I use that, I'll create a display mode, so I set up common ways that gets used, and I'll create my markup, and that's kind of like a component because I'm reusing a pattern multiple times throughout Drupal. Panels. Panels are very much like components. You have panel pages. We talked about that. But then also mini panels and custom content panes. People, I can't remember, did people say, have they worked? A lot of people work with panels, right? So mini panels let you put multiple panes together in like a section. They're very much like that. I had a great conversation with Steve at Chicago where he talked to me about how he was using panels to do very component-based things, where he'd take a mini panel and he'd put a layout on it, and you're the one that brought up the event. I'm like, oh, this event teaser stuff, that's Steve. So everybody give a shout out to Steve. Yeah. So, and he talked about, instead of like regions in a mini panel, each of those regions he treated like as if it was a variable slot for putting in the event name or the date. And then within panels, he could say, all right, here's the data that goes into that component. And then he just had one template that contained all the markup for that component, which I thought was super clever and awesome. And like, I want to be able to do that within Drupal out of the box. So series. So a list of items. Views, right? Views is very much about creating a series of items, about creating a river of news or an event list. And a lot of times you'll end up using display modes or something like that so that you don't have to configure fields every single time. But node queues and entity queues are another ways you can create a series of items by manually controlling the order of individual nodes that you put into a queue. Fields, I was talking about like the data series type of component, and that's basically what a field template is. Field templates are A lot better in Drupal 8 than Drupal 7. They put out a lot of markup in Drupal 7. Now they only put out a lot of markup if you need a lot of markup for things. So, but a field template is basically a wrapper around a series of data items. If you have a field on your node, you can have one or more things, right, that go into that field. You can have multiple images. And so a field template basically is about creating the list, the unordered list around those individual images. And then you have a separate template, typically for the item itself, for like the image. So that's like kind of like what I was talking about with components, but I think there's some challenges also that are tricky about getting components working with Drupal. So, so I think the trickiest thing is, if you were to ask me like one of Drupal's superpowers, I would say structuring data, right? We're great at modeling data in a way, instead of having a big blob of text, we create fields, we create relationships between different things. We're really good at modeling data. But a lot of the ways that Drupal's theme system works is essentially saying, cool, you've got this really great data model. Now, here's a template for each of those things on the data model. And it's really about decorating the data model instead of talking about what we're looking at, breaking down a design into smaller and smaller parts. It's more about, all right, so we're going to render the node, and there's fields within that node. And then that node might have associated blocks based on a bunch of rules, and that's going to go on the outside based on the page template that we're on. And so it's kind of this funky connection of data and templates that I think is kind of awkward. But I think where it really gets difficult to work with a component-based theme is you need to use a lot of templates to make one thing. If I want to make an event teaser, I typically, there's probably a lot more. This is just like how many could reasonably fit on the slide without overwhelming everybody. But you probably have a node teaser template for an event where you put some of the wrapper markup for that node teaser. But then you're going to have a field template for the image because I want some specific markup around that. But then I need to do an image template itself because I want to put a class on the image. And then I have a list of tags, so I've got a field template there, and it goes on and on. If I want to create one single component, I might need like 6, 8, 10 different templates, and it gets to be really overwhelming, and it doesn't really work well in conjunction with these pattern library and style guide tools, because those pattern library and style guide tools assume that you have one template that has all the markup for your component. But in Drupal you have like 10. So you can't really just reuse that markup very easily within these external tools that help make it easier for you to manage components. So you end up writing the markup twice, once within Drupal and once within these pattern libraries. And if you're writing two things that are exactly the same, in theory, they tend to get out of sync. And you can have the best of intentions that I want to have this great style guide that's going to be useful for everybody. But when push comes to shove and you get to a project and you got to make your decisions about, we've got to get this project out the door. We have a limited number of things we can do in a limited amount of time. You have to make your decision about what's important. A lot of times the style guide gets, you got to pick what's more important, the public website or the style guide. And it's hard to keep that style guide in sync when you have 2 copies of your markup, which totally makes sense. It would be better if I could use the same markup in both places. That would be a better thing. And that's hard to do a lot of times because there's all these templates. And why do we have all these templates in the first place? So this is an analogy. So people work with Sass, right? And maybe you're doing partials, right, for each of your different components within your Sass. And so one thing you'll find is that if you're doing that, you might set up your base styles for your site. And you'll say, here are all the base styles. Here's how a paragraph is styled. Here's how a heading element is styled. Here's how a image is styled. And sometimes that's really useful. But if you start having components where you've got 10 different ways where a heading is used, and they look different in every single location, it becomes less useful that you set those base styles. You've overridden them 10 different times. And that's kind of like what Drupal's template system is like. We have these base templates for things like field. But if you override that field template 10 different times, it's not really that helpful that you have that field template because it's kind of going to get in the way for you every single time. So I think this is generally true in a lot of things, but as the number of times that you have overrides increases, the value of setting that base styles or those base markup, it becomes less value the more overrides you have. So I think that's a challenge with working with Drupal's theme system the way it is right now. Okay, so temperature's rising, and so we're going to talk about, all right, so that was more about like how do you work with components inside of Drupal, but a lot of discussion that's going about is how could we use components outside of Drupal? How could we make that work? And there's a lot of challenges. So I want to talk about some of those challenges because we have a lot of smart people in this room and you might have ideas on how to solve them, and then you can say, hey, we should do this, and then everything will be better because we won't have problems anymore, and that'll be great. So, and then I'll talk about ways people are trying to solve those afterwards, and there'll be a ray of shining hope. But here's the things that are hard. So, drillability. I kind of got into this, is that you might have a node template and you might have multiple fields that are going in there. And it's hard to have one template per component. You might have this article teaser and you have a tags field. And then you have individual tags within there. And if you have a template for each of those things, it gets really unwieldy. And so if we're going to make component-based theming in Drupal really good, I think we need to have drillability. We need to have a way to, instead of having separate templates for data series and items, maybe there's a way that we can reuse those tags. Right now we just have a separate template every time we have this like field wrapper and we have the individual item. And we don't want to reuse like a template within image. We don't want to construct an image element every single time that we create a component. But maybe there's some ways to like iterate through a list of these items, and a field template usually has an attributes object. Attributes objects are a good way for modules and things to add extensions to information. And so maybe we can use that attributes object, and that's the way that modules provide their ways to modify how this template might work, how the data in that template might work. So so that's one area, is how do we minimize the number of templates by being able to drill down and include multiple things into one component. The next thing is pre-process functions are pretty challenging. Have people worked with pre-process functions in a theme? Oh, about half? A lot of people here? Okay, so a pre-process function. What does a pre-process function do? The main goal is to take raw data from Drupal, and we're going to turn that into variables that go into a template. We're going to do a lot of processing of that stuff, and then we get variables. That's most of what a pre-process function does. The challenge is that we're doing that within PHP. And there's a lot of people who want to use components outside of something that's PHP-based. If we want to use a component in one of these pattern library tools or style guide, or even more complicated, if we want to use this within a client-side framework, if we want to reuse this within JavaScript, well, there's no PHP to do that processing necessarily. If you're doing like a decoupled site, and you might have a REST API endpoint where you're getting raw data, so you kind of have the raw data, that could be the same, but you don't have the processing that takes that raw data and turns it into template variables. So we've been talking about, well, how could we solve that? One idea that a lot of people kind of have come to is, instead of having a PHP function does that, maybe we have an intermediary twig template that does that logic. So you'd have that raw data, but instead of sending it into a PHP function, you would have a twig template. And that twig template doesn't have any markup in it. It just has some logic that does the similar sort of logic you'd have in the PHP. And you would turn that raw data into variables that get passed in to the component template, which is where your HTML lives. So that way, you could have the Twig template going back and forth. There's a project called Twig.js that might let us use Twig with JavaScript. So maybe that would be one way to reduce this as a problem. Preprocess, I kind of mentioned, is a way for modules to add extensibility. That's one of the things that Drupal is really great at, is how extensible it is. You add a module and it adds a new thing. And modules often, one of the things they do is work with these preprocess functions to change the variables that are going to a specific template. So how would we do that? And the thought we had was maybe each module could register and say, okay, for this component, here's my Twig presenter template. And that one will add in some variable processing, and then we'll take all the registered Twig templates and we'll include each of those in this main presenter template when we render it, which is maybe a little bit complicated, but we're trying to brainstorm ways that we can get around some of the problems for using Drupal-like things outside of Drupal. Another thing that's tricky is child components. How do you include one component inside of another? In Drupal, we have render arrays, but that's not a thing outside of Drupal. So how do we make that work? And I think of render arrays as they're self-rendering arrays. People work with render arrays? So some people, not everybody. A render array is a thing. It's an array that has different pieces of data that you use to decide what are we going to do with this data. How do we turn that into markup on the page? And you can put lots of data in there. You can put an entire node object inside of a render array. You can put huge reams of data. And because we have lots of data inside this thing that represents the markup that's going to be put out on the site, we can decide, hey, here's the template that we're going to use to render the markup. And so, because we talked about how there's you have a node teaser and you have a node, there's different templates that you can use for just a node. There's multiple options. And so a render array helps to pick which template actually gets used, which is pretty neat. And the thing is, they can contain any number of elements inside of them. And that ends up being really handy for site builders, because the thing that site builders do with Drupal is they use the user interface to make choices about how the appearance of the site looks, right? You choose, here are the fields that will display on a node, and here's how they will look. Here is a block, and here's where it goes in which region. You can make lots of decisions right in the user interface about how things get changed. And the ultimate effect of that is that the things that get chosen in the user interface each of those things gets put in a render array, and they get put in one big giant variable. So you have like a content variable that has these individual items within it. But that's not the way that JavaScript frameworks tend to work, or style guides tend to work. Typically, they will specifically have a line that says, include this template, and here's the variables I'm passing into it. And whether you're using React, or you're using Angular, or you're using Pattern Lab, typically you specify, here's the thing that I'm including. And that doesn't really fit very well with Drupal's model of you can include an arbitrary number of things. So trying to brainstorm how you could fix that, my thought is that you could, have people used twig blocks? Have people used twig much? So twig has this concept of twig blocks. In Drupal, the only place that we're using them is actually with Drupal's blocks. So we put some twig blocks in your blocks so that when you use blocks, you can put twig blocks in your blocks. So that's the primary exhibit for how you do that in Drupal. A twig block is a way to say, in this template, we're going to say, whatever's inside this twig block, you can extend this template, and then the only thing you have to do is you can change out what's within that twig block. So you can only change out part of a template instead of having to recreate a template every time you extend it, which is pretty cool. So maybe we could do that with this. Maybe we could have a twig block that says, hey, normally you just have this variable like content, but then if you're going to extend this so that you can use it in a pattern library or in JavaScript, you could specifically put in your include statements. So it might mean doing a little bit of extra work in some places where you're not necessarily using the exact same templates in both places, but maybe that's a way to fork it and let things happen in multiple ways. But it's kind of an example of one of the inherent challenges of making components work outside of Drupal is that Drupal has site builders, and that's really great. I think it's awesome that Drupal empowers people to make changes to the way their site looks without having to hire a developer every time they need to move something around in their site. That's fantastic. It lets more people use the web. But a lot of frameworks and style guides are predicated on the idea of the front-end developer has complete control over this entire experience. But they don't have to worry about somebody making a change in the user interface, and that affects how things look. So I think that we need to really keep that in mind as we design a solution to make Drupals more component-based, is making sure we preserve that ability for site builders to affect the user interface. Attributes are also a unique Drupal thing, but I'm not sure how well they work outside of Drupal. It's an object that modules can add stuff to, and then it determines the attributes that appear on an HTML element. And that's not necessarily something that exists outside of Drupal. Pattern Lab has provided one example, though, about how you might make that work. They wrote some Twig extensions. Drupal has some custom extensions to Twig that lets us do some specific things, like get Twig to work with our translation system. In Pattern Lab, there's a project that adds those things to Pattern Lab so that Drupal templates can work outside of Drupal, and attributes, they have an extension to make attributes work outside of Drupal. So there might be some ways to make this happen. Theme tree. The other thing that I think might be a little bit tricky is that what appears on your website in Drupal, it's kind of complicated how that actually happened. A lot of people think about your theme as, here's the thing where we make all the decisions about how your site looks. But that's not really the case. You're not having all the decisions about how your site looks in the theme. I like to think of the theme as the veto point. It's where the final decision gets made about how your site looks. But a lot of decisions about how your site looks, your markup, your CSS, your JavaScript, actually happen at a much lower level. They happen in core, or in a contrib module that you add, or in a base theme. And your theme might override some of those things. But there might be a lot of things that are coming from core and contrib and a base theme. So if we're going to integrate a JavaScript framework or a pattern library with Drupal, how do we get it to know about that? You can't just necessarily point at the theme and then you find all the files there, and that's how you're going to make it work. Somehow, that outside source is going to have to know about this inheritance tree and when we're using one template or another. In Drupal, we control that with the theme registry, which is really deep down in Drupal, and I know there's a word called registry, and it's involved with doing these sorts of things. But that's like mostly what I know about it. And I guarantee you most JavaScript frameworks probably do not know what's going inside our theme registry, and making that work with an outside source can be tricky. And if you don't know which template is being used at any given time, if you're using a Twig extends, how do you know if you're extending off something that's being overridden by a theme or by a module, that sort of thing? So there's some areas where this would be hard. Libraries are another area where this is difficult. How do we know your theme doesn't contain all the CSS and JavaScript that gets rendered on your site? You can blow away all other sources and just make your theme the only source. But a lot of times you get things that are coming from modules within your theme. So Drupal 8 has this concept called libraries. And a library is really cool. A library says, here's a related set of CSS and JavaScript, and here's its dependencies. You can define, I have this one JavaScript, and it depends on jQuery. And you don't need to specifically have your theme say, you don't have to, if you put a thing and you say that jQuery is a dependency, it will load jQuery. But if you don't do that, jQuery is not going to load by default on your site unless you've specified it as a dependency. So libraries are kind of cool. They do some neat things. But again, it's complicated because those are attached to parts of Drupal in a lot of different ways. Sometimes they're attached to a specific template, but a lot of times a library is attached through the URL that you go to, or some pre-processed logic. Like complex logic will determine whether we attach a library or not. So how do we know that if you're having a style guide that's trying to say, here's how my Drupal site looks, how is it going to know how those libraries will work? And so that's a challenge. Context is another thing. We talked about context is how does a component say, here's the data that I need. How do we specify that in a way that could be used by outside sources so they understand too? We've talked about specifying context through a YAML file that says, have people used YAML yet in Drupal 8? Pretty straightforward text format. It's cool. Some people like JSON. That's cool too. So JSON gets used a lot more in JavaScript probably than YAML does. But either way, you could maybe have a file that says, here's the things I need for this component. But I think there's some unknowns, like how would we make that work with an outside source? How do we make that bubble up? How do we have a definition of context that works in this component, but then the component 2 levels up knows that, hey, I need to pass this data down 2 levels down to a component down there. Block plugins, I mentioned, handle context pretty well, so maybe that could be involved, but they don't necessarily work outside of Drupal. So basically what I'm saying is complicated. There's a lot of challenges. I think this component stuff could be really cool, but I think it's important to think through, like, there's a lot of challenges in making this work inside Drupal and outside of Drupal. I'd like to see it happen. I kind of wonder if maybe we should focus on making this work really well inside Drupal, because I think we could do that. I think that's a doable goal. But when we try to integrate with outside sources, I think it adds an extra order or 2 orders of complexity. And yet, I also recognize that this is why I initially got excited. I use Pattern Lab, and I want Drupal to work better with Pattern Lab. So I'd love to find a way to solve these problems. Which leads me into a lot of people are working on solving these theming problems. So, and we're all family together, so. You, your chunks, and me. So what are some of the things that people are doing to try to solve these problems in Drupal 8? John Albin has a module called Component Libraries. And what that lets you do is register a twig namespace, an @theme name sort of thing, that lets you put a folder outside of your templates folder where you can bundle all your CSS and JavaScript and templates together in one place without it having to be in the templates folder. That's kind of a rough summary. There may be some other cool things happening. And so he's kind of trying to look at components in that way. And he's trying to work on doing that with the Zen theme as he's updating that for Drupal 8. And I mentioned these presenter templates having like an intermediary twig template. So he's kind of trying to work on doing that. So taking the template for, like, say, a node template, and then doing includes and things to pass on, not having that have any markup, but pass it on to individual component templates that actually have the markup. So I think that's a cool thing to take a look at, see how that's working. There's been some efforts to get Pattern Lab to work really well with Drupal. There is a Drupal Twigs edition of Pattern Lab, which I think is cool because it lets you use twig templates, and it has those twig extensions that lets Drupal's templates work pretty well in Pattern Lab. And Phase 2 put together a starter kit for an example of how to make this work, how to use these presenter templates, how to use the twig extensions. So that's definitely worth taking a look at. Pattern Builder is a tool built, Micah Godbold's been talking about this, and he uses JSON schemas to define basically the context sort of stuff. He uses a JSON file, and that defines, here's the requirements for this component, and he actually uses that to create actual entities within Drupal, paragraph entities that actually, so he's doing some interesting integrations of Drupal and this Pattern Builder tool that helps you build components. So that's interesting. But I think the real thing to take a look at, I think everybody should try those other things out, but Wim Leers, who's done a lot of really cool things with Drupal, he's done the Big Pipe stuff. People have heard of Big Pipe for Drupal 8. A lot of cool performance things. And Wim Leers is working on he's got a patch that's trying to do some component stuff right within Drupal. So we might be able to get this into Drupal core. The neat thing about Drupal 8 is we can put new features into it every 6 months. And so the window for when we can get stuff in for 8.2 closes in 6 weeks. So I'm not sure that this will get in for that, but maybe it gets in for 8.3, which would be like next April. But all that depends on if people test it out. And if they try it and say, hey, I like this, or I don't like that. And another thing is that we have a Slack for Drupal Twig. And it's called Drupal Twig, but it's really about all things front end with Drupal. We've gotten a lot of engagement. You know, IRC is a great tool, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of people who who've been more engaged with this Slack that we have than they have been on IRC, even though IRC is a great open source tool. So I'll have these slides up, I'll tweet them out, so you don't have to write down all these links. Please don't write down all those node numbers. And you can go there and get an invite to join, and everybody's welcome. We have a channel dedicated to talking about components. And we have meetings. We're trying to have weekly meetings on Wednesdays to talk about this stuff. So if you think this would be cool, maybe I want to try this out and talk to other people, you could stop by. So, all right. So we're going to play that chunky music. I just kind of want to recap, because I had some depressing things in the middle there. And I want non-depressing things to end this. So I want to talk about how could this look? How could this look if we were able to make this all work? So let's say that you had one component and you defined it in one place and you could reuse it everywhere. That'd be pretty cool. If you had like one template, one source of CSS and JavaScript, and you could reuse that in a style guide or a pattern library, and you had one source of truth, that would be great. Because if you could have it in sync with your production markup, it could be real. It could be a living style guide. This is like the holy grail a lot of people have been trying to chase, is how do we get production markup working with our style guide? And solving these tricky problems that I talked about is what we need to do in order to make this work. So it would be great if this was extensible. Our Drupal theme system is very extensible. You can have modules and base themes and your own theme that all participate as one big happy family to make the actual markup on your site. Everybody gets to put in their own ideas. And it would be neat if our component system allowed the same thing. You could have core define certain components everybody's going to use. Maybe you install a module, and that gives you a component. And a lot of people find that useful. And maybe you have a base theme, and they define, hey, here's a bunch of components we think people find really useful. And your own theme says, hey, all right, I'm going to take this component from there, this component from there. I'm going to put it all together and give you some extra components because those would be useful. And so you have a whole bunch of components that you can use throughout your site to make it neat. It would be great if you could reuse this on the client side with JavaScript. There's a lot of talk about improving Drupal's user experience, author experience. Components are one big part of that as to how we can, I think that's one of the requirements to do some of these big improvements to Drupal's authoring experience. I mentioned web components, how those could be a benefit. They might be a big thing down the road, and I think we should be ready for them when they come down. And making Drupal's theme system more component-based could help make that happen. And I mentioned before that I think this could be useful for site builders. So briefly want to talk about how that could work. You know, if you imagine that you're a site builder and you go and say, I'm going to define a page component. So panels and panels everywhere provide some examples of how you can do that. If you had a user interface where it said, here's a page component. And then you say, I'm going to add some sections to that page component. Things like mini panels are examples of how that can be done. And then I'm going to say, all right, I want to put a river of news here in this section. And so then you go and you define, here's the rules I want to use to define how I want to sort that list of news items. And then I go in and I say, here I want to define how that actual item looks like. Here's the pieces that I care about for that component. So, you know, maybe there's some tools that draw off of the tools that are available in views and display modes and panel panes that let you put together, here's an item component. And Maybe sometimes you're picking from a generic layout that you say this is a 2-column display, and so you put stuff into that. And then sometimes you have extensions. So you might have a base page template that has your header and footer, and then you have like 5 other templates that all base off of that one. So you don't have to set the header and footer every single time you create a new page component. And if we had that level of extensibility for site builders, I think that'd be really cool. That would save time, and it would, I think, mesh with the mental model that people have. So it is raining chunks. Hallelujah, it is raining chunks. So how can you help? I mentioned a lot of implementations out there. If you go and try them out and then say, hey, I like this, I didn't like that, I think that's important. Join us on Slack to chat about it. And then come by on Sunday. Come sprint. How many people are planning on coming to sprint day? That's like my favorite day of the camp, so more of you need to come. If you decided, I don't know if I want to do that, like, you should come. It's fun. Like, you don't need, like, if you just want to talk with other people, that's totally cool. That's a great thing to do at sprint day. Sprint day is not just about sitting down and coding. It's about having conversations with other people. And so if this interests you at all, hopefully, then you should come. I thought it was important that I had a cat slide in here, so I do. A disco cat slide. That's my reward for you listening to me jabber about this stuff. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Please come talk to me. I'd love to talk to you about components and hear your ideas and thoughts and feedback and suggestions. And, you know, I tweet about this stuff. Follow me on Twitter. And talk to me on Twitter. So I like chatting with people. So thanks, everybody. I've kind of reached the end of my time, so if anybody has questions, feel free to come up and chat.